Lesson 9 Project Help. So let's go ahead and look at Lesson 9. So as Farmer Frank progresses further into his farm, he finds a section of grapevines in a barn. The vines are all labeled by the highest agreed term of the polynomial that models their behavior. He sees that the vines actually dip down into the earth and back up again over the rafters in some cases. He notices that each vine seems to behave like its label. So for instance, a vine labeled x squared looks parabolic, starting in the earth, looping up over the rafters, and then plunging back into the earth, while a vine labeled X begins in the earth and then ends up at the rafters. So here's a picture of a barn. So if we look at the first one of the x squared that looks parabolic, it says that it starts in the earth, so it would start down here, it would go up, loop around a rafter here, and then come back down. So it looks like a parabola. And then if we look at the next one there of x, if we draw out the x one here, it begins in the earth and it ends up in the rafters. So it would just look like what our graph of x would look like, just a straight line there between them. So he has different vines all throughout his barn that we're going to take a look at and see if we can figure out some different things about them. Several of the vines are missing their labels though, which have been torn off by mean-spirited barn gnomes that the farmer had chased out of the rest of the garden. The farmer sets himself to relabeling those vines with missing labels. So these darn gnomes here took off all of our labels. So now we got to figure out where our labels go. So the first unlabeled vine the farmer sees begins in the rafters, plunges into the earth, then returns to the rafters, then plunges again into the ground. What would be a possible label that makes sense for this vine? Well, let's draw a picture. So let's pretend that here's our rafter, and then down here is so this is our earth down here, and this is a rafter up here. So it says that it begins in the rafters, plunges into the earth. Alright, so it begins in the rafters, plunges down into the earth, then returns to the rafters. So now we got it's returning to the rafters, then plunges again into the ground. So what would be a possible label that makes sense for this vine? Well, if you look at it, what kind of a graph does it look like? Well, it comes down, goes up, and then comes back down. So it has two turns in it, and it has its end behavior is separate, so that means it's got to be an odd function, since its end behavior is that one is going up to infinity and one side is going down to negative infinity, so we know it's an odd function. And then, well, if we look at our odd functions, x would just be straight down. What about the next one, x cubed? Well, this looks like an x cubed to me because remember x cubed would come down, loop back up, and loop back down. So a possible one that makes sense is x cubed. That would be a possible one that makes sense because this looks like an x cubed graph. The farmer finds a label that says 7x to the 14th. What type of vine should the farmer look for? Well, let's look at the exponent first. So we have an even exponent because our exponent is 14. So that means it's an even exponent. So that means our end behavior, they're both going to go in the same way. So for our end behavior, we have that they're both going to go in the same way. So now we need to look at our coefficient. Is it positive or negative? Well, 7 is positive. So we have a positive coefficient here. So that means that our end behavior should that they both ends, since it's even, both ends should point up. So that means that a vine that he should look for would be one that starts and ends in the rafters. So it's going to start and end in the rafters because we want them both ends to go up. And then if it's power of 14, it's an even power, that either means that we're going to have some different loops here where it's going to loop up and down, or we're going to have one smooth loop, but it's going to be bumpy here. So that would be what kind of a vine the farmer should be looking for. One where it ends and starts in the rafters and either has some loops, or it ends and starts in the rafters and is very bumpy in the middle. That's the type of vine that our farmers should be looking for. Hope this helps with your Lesson 9 project.